Hey folks, so today is a pretty big day for Corsair. As well as launching its iCUE Elite capitalise coolers, which we have a review of, the company is also bringing to market some new mid-tower cases. We have at £80 and $80 US, we've got the 4000D and the 4000D Airflow, the only difference between them being the front panel, which is obviously ventilated on the Airflow version. And then we have a more exotic version of the same chassis, and this is coming to market for £110 or $120 in the US, and that is the iCUE 4000X RGB, which, as you can see, has a tempered glass solid front panel with 3 RGB fans and an iCUE RGB controller inside. So as you can see, we've been outfitted with one of each from the full range, and there are 6 SKUs in total because each one comes in either black or white. And on the white one, I think Corsair's done a pretty good job. I mean, the grey and the yellow, it strikes me as something quite sporty. Again, aesthetics are always going to be something that is very subjective, whether you like it or not. The yellow highlights are also present on the black version, but the filters and highlights are all black there as well. Having all three means that we're going to be able to show what difference the front panel makes between the Airflow and the standard version, and we'll also be able to test the impact of having a solid front panel with 3 fans behind it. We'll get to those results later, so for now, let's focus on the build quality and features. Now overall, I would say that the build quality is pretty good considering it's an £80 chassis. It's definitely not going to blow your socks off, but it doesn't have all of the excessive plastic that can sometimes afflict cases of this type. It's steel on the side panel, steel on the roof, and it's pleasing to see that the front panel, even when ventilated, is also steel. It holds together nicely, and it just generally feels fairly well built. So both the 4000D and the 4000D Airflow come with the exact same fan configuration out of the box. You get a 120mm front intake and a 120mm rear exhaust, creating a fairly balanced airflow situation. Now, the fans themselves are a new design featuring what Corsair is calling air guide technology. And it's essentially some plastic on the back which helps to guide and concentrate the airflow, presumably resulting in better performance. Now, as for the iCUE 4000X RGB, this one comes with an extra fan for the extra investment, and of course, they're all RGB. These ones are SP120 RGB Elite fans, and they also benefit from the air guide technology on the back. Now, there is no exhaust fan on this case, so the airflow arrangement is slightly different. It's more of a positive pressure situation. Of course, they're relying on the pressure to exhaust air through the natural ventilation points, such as out of the top and out of the back. Now, as for the maximum number of fans you can install, it really depends on the size of fan that you're using. For 120mm, it's 6, 3 in the front, 2 in the roof, and 1 in the back. Or if you have 140mm, it's 2 in the front and 2 in the roof. The back fan mount does not support the 140mm size fan. In terms of what you get out of the box, I think Corsair's striking the minimum. I think 1 in the front, 1 in the rear is about what you would expect for the price. And the expandability is also very standard for a mid-tower of this size and price. What's also important, of course, is dust filtering. For the roof, Corsair has an external magnetic filter, very easy, and it stays down very securely. It's all very straightforward, to be honest. And then at the front, you have a filter behind the steel panel, which pops off like that. And then it's a magnetic filter at the top, using hooks at the bottom. It's quite simple to remove, clean, and replace. There is one more, which is at the back, and this is a slide out one for the PSU. Very simple, a little bit basic. More advanced designs tend to slide out from the front, but the inclusion of only a smaller one is easy to understand at the given price point. All in all, I think Corsair ticks the right boxes in terms of dust filters covering all the necessary points and doing so with easy to access filters. The final things to note on the outside of the case, the front panel is very modern, very simple and straightforward. It's mounted on the roof, makes it easy to access. It's got one USB 3 port, one USB 3.1 Type C port, and a combination jack for headphone and microphone. It's a very modern looking front panel, very simple. And then on the back, we can also see that there are vertical mounts. Now, you don't get the necessary mounting equipment to mount your GPU vertically, but it's good to know that the case supports it. Although I must admit that the fans are going to be running very, very close to that tempered glass side panel. So that covers the outside of the cases, but what about the inside? Well, you've already seen how easy it is to get at the front panel. The front steel cover and the dust filter are both easy to remove, and really to access the fan mounts, that's all you need to do. There's no need to remove the plastic, and it's fastened on very tightly. As for the side panels, they have some captive thumb screws at the back, very standard, and then there are hooks at the front, which they're not quite a hinge mechanism, but they sort of function as a hinge. They guide the panel into place and they help it push inwards. It's much better than notches and rails where you have to kind of grind the panel into place, but it's not as good as a full and proper hinged system. So inside we have a fairly standard modern mid-tower layout. It's not going to win any awards for innovation, but nor do we expect it to. So we have a fixed position shroud for the PSU. It's going to hide your cables, but bear in mind it is ventilated, and on the white version especially, that may make your cables a bit more visible. Most cables tend to be black, so that's something to bear in mind. The build quality on the inside again holds up. It's solid and rigid where it needs to be, and usability is pretty good too. So starting with the motherboard, the mounts come pre-installed and they include a longer central one, which just helps keep the board in place as you initially position it. Corsair advertises the fact that motherboards up to 277mm wide can be installed, so that's ATX plus a bit extra, and there is a cable routing bracket here which helps disguise the cables coming off the side of the motherboard. And to enable the 277mm width thing, you're going to have to move this forward. But thankfully this is easily done. It's released with a single screw behind it, and then it's on some rails and you can just jolt it forward. Now the open layout means that once the board is in place, it's very easy to install the bigger components like CPU coolers and graphics cards. Now speaking of, there's a 170mm clearance for coolers and 360mm for GPUs. Now as for water cooling, Corsair has ensured that you can fit 360mm or 280mm radiators up front, and there's around 65mm of clearance in total between the case and the shroud, and that includes the fans. Up top, the offset mounts mean that you can mount two 40mm radiators or two 80mm radiators, and if you're going for the 280mm radiators, you're going to need to ensure that you have low profile RAM. Corsair tells us that its LPX modules will work fine, but I'm sure that other low profile memory is also available. So if we turn the case around, we can start to have a look at the drives and the cable management, and we'll start with the drives. So starting here behind the motherboard, we have two independent SSD trays, and these each have their own captive thumb screw, and they're easily released from the case. This makes them very easy to use, and they're made of steel. Pretty standard stuff, but just very simple to be honest. Now down beneath the PSU shroud, there is another HDD cage, and this can hold another two drives, and this time it's either 3.5 inch or 2.5 inch. The trays themselves are made of plastic, and they're tool-free to locking 3.5 inch drives, just using these pins, although it's a shame that there isn't any rubber on them. But otherwise, all very easy to use, and they lock back in place nice and securely. The cage itself can also be released using these thumb screws down here, and once you do that, you'll be able to remove the cage entirely or slide it a bit further forward in the case, therefore making room for longer PSUs or more cables. So from this angle, you can also see Corsair's new cable routing system, and much like the Air Guide fans, it has squished together two words to create a feature name, and this one is the Rapid Route Cable Management System. And what it consists of is some plastic brackets which help guide the cables, and it's also got three Velcro cables attached to hooks, which means that you can loosen, put your cables through, and then tighten afterwards. It's not perfect, but it does work very well, and it's much better than most of the implementations on the market. The other thing to note is that this hole here, combined with the cable management bracket, allows thicker cables, such as the motherboard one, to sit in here without impeding on the side panel and without being seen through the tempered glass. All in all, I would say that the Rapid Route Cable Management System is largely successful. We certainly didn't have any issues when building our system and keeping it tidy. One thing to note in addition though is that the iCUE 4000X RGB comes with an RGB hub, which adds a few extra cables to the mix. So you've got your RGB cables connected to it out of the box. The fan cables run separately, but the hub itself also has SATA and data connectors. So just a few extra cables to deal with on the RGB one, but I'm sure you're used to that. And the final thing to note about cable routing is that there is ample space above and below using these holes here to feed cables in for the secondary connectors, which is a factor in every system. And last but not least, the power supply is also inserted from this side, just slides in here and is screwed in from the back. I think Corsair has cheaped out a little bit by going for foam pads instead of rubber, but it's a very small point, and as you remember, the PSU is amply protected by a dust filter on the bottom. So with that all out of the way, it's time to move on to the performance testing, and you can see our test system built into the Airflow edition, but we'll also be looking at how the front panel affects things, testing it in the 4000D typical layout, non-Airflow, as well as the RGB version. We're going to test all three and see what difference they make. Before we get to the graphs, I want to point out that our review sample came with a front filter that was too loose and was getting partially sucked into the front fan, hampering airflow and causing an annoying noise. It was a disappointing start for sure. Now Corsair has of course chalked it up to a pre-production issue and is now having its quality control team specifically look out for it. Now this is a very common excuse, but in fairness, the other two cases that we received had dust filters that do not have this issue, so it does make it more believable, and I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt as a result. Moving on to the results, with our standard case test system, which you can read about in detail on the website, the regular 4000D isn't awful, but a CPU delta T of 64 degrees is very middle of the road, and the difference in airflow compared to an open test bench is significant. Switching to the Airflow version, we immediately see a significant improvement of 13 degrees here. The CPU overclock and the cooler's fan speed are deliberately tuned to highlight differences in case airflow, so you shouldn't expect a similar result on your own system. Instead, the Airflow edition will allow the same CPU cooler to operate at lower speeds and with lower noise levels. Our test system's GPU is not as sensitive to airflow differences as the CPU cooler, but the Airflow case is able to just outperform the open test bench, which is always good to see, while the regular 4000D is again pretty average. The combination of the fans and the front panel works well for both CPU and GPU cooling, and it's also pleasing that the maximum fan speed of the air guide fans isn't all that loud. We also refitted the 4000D Airflow to mimic the iCUE 4000X RGB. Again, this case has 3 intake fans, but the tempered glass front panel restricts the airflow to them. In the end, it's only about as good as the regular 4000D despite the increased fan count. This setup is actually very similar to the iCUE 465X RGB from last year, but I think the front panel on that one is better designed for airflow and more spacious, which results in better CPU and GPU performance. So to wrap things up, I'd say that this is a pretty solid entry into the case market from Corsair, and it's one that I'm happy to recommend if you like the design. Now there's nothing outstanding about them, but in terms of features, design and performance, they're pretty solid all-rounders, and at £80 or $80, the price definitely feels right. Now given the tangible effect that the solid front panel can have on airflow and temperatures, I'd always push people towards the ventilated Airflow edition over that one. I mean, it's the same price and your CPU and GPU coolers are going to be running cooler and with lower noise as a result of the extra ventilation. However, if you do like the cleaner looks that you can get from the solid front panel, you can get that one, and you can always buy and upgrade to the ventilated one should it ever become necessary. Finally, the iCUE 4000X RGB will no doubt appeal to RGB enthusiasts out there, but it's worth remembering that it also has its own airflow limitations as a result of the solid front panel. For the same money, you could also get a better case if you forego RGB, but that's kind of besides the point. If you want RGB, it's a pretty good value off-the-shelf solution, and it's made better by the fact that it has an RGB hub with scope to add up to 3 more accessories, and iCUE is always a pleasure to use. So that's it from us today. I hope you've enjoyed the case review being in video format. Please let me know what you thought in the comments, and remember that you can also find us on social media and head over to the website to read the review in more detail. Thanks for watching.